So we're live now. I would like to welcome you all. Welcome to the second episode of our current season of Sheltering Places, titled The Means of Organization, using digital tools in the work of political organizing. In this panel discussion, our researcher Eric Meier will facilitate a conversation on the role of digital tools in political organizing and how they can help augment our collective capacities by focusing on the experience of existing organizations and their practices, structures, and challenges. Just a quick introduction for our guests. Alex Worrad-Andrews is a member of Common Knowledge, where he works as a software engineer and project manager. Common Knowledge is a non-hierarchical, not-for-profit cooperative that works with grassroots organizers and communities around the world to design and build digital tools to multiply their impact, build power, and achieve radical change. Gemma Copeland is a member of Common Knowledge also, where she works on design and research. Burgess is the Autonomy's head of advocacy, a progressive research organization that focuses on tackling climate change, the future of work, and economic planning through providing economic analysis, advanced data analytics, policy proposals, and on-the-ground solutions with which to confront the changing reality of our economy and society today. Their aim is to pursue ecological future-proofing, real freedom, equality, and human flourishing. Callum Cant is the author of Working for Deliveroo, a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute and co-editor of the Workers' Inquiry journal, Notes from Below. His research focuses on artificial intelligence in the workplace, and during 2019 UK general election, he worked at the Momentum Communications team and then led the team as head of communications in 2020 and 2021. Eric Meier, which is our certificate student and host for today, is a strategic network facilitator at the Association for the Design of History. He brings together scholars and thinkers on political strategy, economic planning, and organization to intensify their impact on political practice. Recently, Meier co-translated the Outwalk Manifesto and Hito's thorough commentary on the recent Documenta 15 from German to English. And just to remind those of you who are watching, we are the New Center, have open scholarship applications for the upcoming fall-winter season. And to apply, you can submit your application by September 5. And we have announcements on art and education, which you can check on our social media profiles. And I'll pass the mic now to Eric, and have a great episode for you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassia. Yeah, hello, everybody. Also, the audience, hello. And I'd say we start with the detailed introduction rounds, and we're going to come to the more detailed questions later. As Cassia already said, you can post questions, comments in the live chat. Basically all of the time. I'm going to copy them out of there if they seem super interesting. And yeah, so let's go.
Okay, I'm going first. Yeah, so I think that was a pretty good introduction of our work. Just to kind of flesh that out a bit more, we work in direct collaboration with a really wide range of organizations. So sometimes it's grassroots trade unions, renters unions, community groups, a lot of, I guess, direct action organizations. So lots of climate justice ones at the moment, healthcare, that kind of thing. And yeah, we work with them to try and to listen to them, to understand their needs and help them achieve their political goals. Usually this kind of falls into one of three categories. So there's a lot of it is about designing and building digital tools, but there's also providing training and strategic advice. There are some groups that we work with where we just have kind of regular calls to talk about how they run their organization. And a big part of our work as well is about facilitating the sharing of knowledge between all these different groups, like looking for ways that challenges are shared, or even, I guess, aims are shared, and how we can work together rather than in silos. And yeah, I'll pass to Alex in case there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, so it's important to us as well to constitute ourselves in a way that enables us to do that work. So one of the ways in which we do that is that we're constituted as a workers' cooperative, and much of the work that we do is with other cooperatives. So there's a kind of a network that we're part of that's called CoTech, and we attempt to work, as I said, in this kind of like non-hierarchical manner, attempting to work in a way that like resonates with the values that we hold of solidarity and thoughtfulness and so on and so forth. And I think that what's important for us is not seeing digital technology as a silver bullet for kind of solving the problems of kind of contemporary political organization. I think we're quite there was kind of perhaps a naive optimism at the turn of the millennia, or maybe a little bit afterwards, in the kind of during the periods of the Arab Spring, perhaps, that kind of digital technology, social media in particular, would democratize access and probably hopefully redistribute power just because of the technology itself. I think that we feel that that's in retrospect quite a naive perspective, and what we want to do is use technology, careful technology that we design with those organizers to build power, and that's kind of what we're about. So we're not concerned with the idea that technology is a solution to political organizing problems as such, but as a kind of accelerant and a potential catalyst when done well.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, India, please.
Hi everyone, it's good to be here. So as was said, I'm head of advocacy at Autonomy, and again, I think it's a pretty good summary of what we do. We're a think tank or research organization, mainly focused on the future of work, but increasingly we do work around climate change and just transitions as well. We do a lot on the 4-day week and working time reduction, including a consultancy service that we provide, and we also do a lot of work on things around automation, the gig economy, night work, and as I said, just transitions. My work in particular, I lead on our outreach work, which basically involves connecting our research with the relevant organizations, whether that's trade unions, public sector organizations, community groups, or private sector organizations as well. I act as a coordinator for the European Working Time Reduction Network, European Network for the Fair Sharing of Working Time. And recently I started supporting on our 4-day week consultancy too. In addition to the outreach work, we organize events and host events. In my predecessor held quite a few roundtables, mostly on discussions around climate and also on AI, to kind of field ideas from different campaign groups and interest groups, to kind of pool knowledge and hear different people's priorities on those subjects. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what Autonomy is doing now around political organizing, kind of how that might be relevant to the panel today. So our main area of work, that has always been our main area of work, would be kind of producing research reports. And these normally would be used to kind of raise public awareness, raise political awareness of an issue. We have a really good comms team, fortunately, so often they'll get placed into relatively mainstream media, which is great. And then more recently, we've been developing more data tools, which I think will be potentially more relevant for this panel today. So one of these is called Aspect, which is a jobs database, which can basically provide a really granular breakdown of every single job role in the UK, which can be kind of skills, experience, abilities, qualifications, kind of all sorts of things. And we basically hope that this will help plan just transitions, as well as other types of transitions. So if a certain sector is going to be scaled down, where will those workers be able to go? And where long-term will they be able to go? And we can look at that in terms of inherently low carbon jobs or kind of actively green jobs, like, a renewable engineer or retrofitting engineer, things like that. And then another capacity we've developed recently is around web crawling and web scraping, basically allowing us to analyze various bits of data from social media, from political websites like Hansard, from job sites like Indeed and Adzuna. And basically these different, there's an aeroplane, I don't know if that's causing a lot of background noise. But basically, kind of in each of these cases, we'll be able to draw interesting bits of analysis to hopefully, again, support the movement. So the bits from job sites should really tie into the jobs database work we're doing. So we'll be able to see how many jobs are being created of the different roles that we've identified, what skills they're saying they need, what qualifications they're saying they need, where they're being created, and essentially where you could identify pretty clear market failures in terms of saying, well, Sunderland needs X number of these people, those jobs aren't being created, or where potentially there are obstacles around saying a certain job needs a qualification, but another role actually matches that job pretty exactly, but the people might not have those qualifications. So how you could kind of overcome obstacles around that. And then in terms of social media and the political messaging, then it would be around kind of understanding what language is being used, where the levers of influence are. So who is, who's the biggest climate denier and the most popular climate denier on Twitter, who's following them, who are their followers talking to, what language are they using that's effective, and kind of drawing insights from that. I think that pretty much covers it for now.
Thanks. Yeah, Callum, your turn.
That's all. Well, yeah, thank you so much for the invite, and it's great to be chatting to you all this evening. I guess I am not really a technology person in a fundamental sense, in that when I began to get involved in questions like this, I was really interested in work first and foremost. So my background is I basically used to work for Deliveroo, right, which is a delivery platform, food delivery. And when the platform economy was starting to spread in 2017, I was working for the platform and very interested by how it seemed that workers were organising despite having no in-person connections. So at that point in time, we didn't realise that the gig economy was going to be the site of a load of struggles over the next 5 years. We were kind of expecting it that workers were very atomised, very displaced, rarely meeting each other, and that as a result, they were going to struggle to organise at all. But then in 2017, we saw these huge strikes emerge in London over issues of wages and around kind of migration questions and immigration raids. And I was really interested in that, started digging more and more into the questions of why that was happening. And when you're working on questions in the platform economy, you can't really avoid technology. It's a major part of how work has been reorganized. So from going down that rabbit hole, I got more and more involved in the study of work and the study of technology at work, to the point that it became my kind of main research focus. So that was partly the book. That's partly also Notes from Below, the Workers' Inquiry platform I was introduced as being part of. We started that in 2018 as a way to create and circulate workers' inquiries, which essentially are workers analysing their own work, or people working with workers to analyse their own work. And myself and some other comrades thought that was kind of a fundamental methodology, and that one that needed to be revived and used to analyse the contemporary workplace because of significant changes that have occurred basically post deindustrialisation. And our kind of political analysis at the time was that due to declining trade union density, due to declining strike numbers, due to a whole series of kind of serious legal attacks on the trade union movement, there was a long-term failure of the left to kind of get to grips with what was going on in the workplace. So we hope that by conducting workers' inquiries, talking to workers, publishing workers, writing and talking about their own work, we might start to close that gap between the kind of the socialist movement and the movement as it was actually constituted in the workplace. So invariably that was bound up with questions of technology. And then in 2019, I ended up working for Momentum in the doomed general election campaign, which it gives me. I was recently on a holiday with some friends, and we all worked in that campaign. Every time someone brought it up, we're like, no, you're not allowed to talk about it. So this evening is going to be quite traumatic, and we had to break my own rules. But yes, so I worked as part of that campaign. I was at Momentum, which, if people aren't aware, is basically a member organisation within, but not part of, the Labour Party, which organised to support the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and the socialist turn in the Labour Party between 2015 and 2020. We basically were organising a kind of a parallel election campaign that attempted to be more innovative, that attempted to use some more interesting ideas, some more novel modes of mobilisation. It drew a lot on the Bernie Sanders campaign in the US. It was actually, by its own metrics, very successful, even if the overall general election was not very successful. And so, yeah, I was part of that as the one of the communication team leads. And then post that general election, I went back to work as head of comms for a while. So I kind of have understood technology both in the workplace realm, and that's where I work again now, and also the kind of electoral politics realm. And across the two, it's amazing how many similarities there are, right? So it's often just taking like two slightly different perspectives on exactly the same thing. And my work now is at the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm looking primarily at AI in the workplace, so zooming out from platforms to kind of consider one form of technology across the entire economy. And I'm working with the Global Partnership on AI to draw up a list of ethical principles for the operation of AI in the workplace, which is a bit like trying to work out the ethical operation of capitalism. So there's some minor contradictions there that might need working out. But yes, there's lots of interesting stuff there. And hopefully we'll have a report out at the end of this year, kind of analysing some of that stuff. And my goal now is to really work on the AI front more than go back to platforms, I think.
Thank you. One interesting example with this whole constellation, I think, is that, as far as I know, all of the organizations here that are represented here come out of this overall time frame of like the Corbyn era. And okay, we've seen Momentum has like really grappled with, okay, Corbyn isn't a viable figure anymore, where to go now? But then we have Common Knowledge, we have Autonomy, we have, like, they existed before, but like really grew big, Novara Media, like a bunch of organizations that either like were founded or really like grew in that era, but didn't tie themselves too much to Corbyn as a figure, the whole campaign, and survived it. And that's like, we finally have like, okay, hey, how do you do that? How do you maintain that kind of independence and grow through these phases, but you're not too dependent up, okay, if something like that campaign fails, you fail again, that you have like all of these kinds of cycles. And now we have like two successful examples represented here, which can tell us a little bit of like, okay, hey, how did that actually work? With like, okay, Momentum as like kind of the opposite kind of representer right there with like, okay, yeah, they are struggling. So yeah, just as like an overall framing, what I find interesting in this constellation. Yeah, maybe something that's still related to that, the general election in the UK in 2019, the My Campaign Map project that basically has been kind of the trigger all on to even have this panel discussion in the first place. Joe Todd talked about it a little bit in like one Zoom session I was super randomly in. Callum, you have been, I think, the most like in contact with that project in like, okay, you actually worked with it. Can you give us a short breakdown of what My Campaign Map was, how like and how you experienced that project as its role in the overall campaign? Like, yeah, can you give us a short breakdown on that?
Yeah, for sure. So Joe was my boss during the campaign. So he, I remember very clearly, it became essentially more and more obvious this general election was going to happen. So the actual general election, the day itself was in December, but by September, it was kind of like glaringly obvious that this thing was coming. And Momentum started to plan seriously what its role was going to be in the general election campaign. And one of the steps Joe took very early on was to try and draw all the lessons he could from the Bernie Sanders campaign in the US, and how some of the Bernie Sanders campaign had these kind of moments of insurgent success, really. And so he looked particularly at the work of Becky Bond and a few others associated with the Social Practice, a group in the US, who wrote the book Rules for Revolutionaries. And basically that he tried to draw from that big organizing model. Big organizing is what they kind of developed as the term to describe their overall approach. A model for how to turn a sudden surge of kind of volunteer energy and potentially donations into a large scale mobilization. So basically it was a question of scalability, right? He was really interested in how do you turn the taps on at the start of general election campaign and bring in this huge surge of energy and volunteer hours and potential labor and enthusiasm and motivation. And how do you turn that into kind of campaigning outcomes, right? So often if you've got a centrally brokered organization, say we've got like a group of 10 people who do this work day in, day out, and they have kind of a standard job structure within, so say decisions are taken centrally, work's doled out at bi-weekly meetings, and then people go off and do the work on their own, report internally to their teams, and they will come back in a couple of times a week to distribute more work. If you think of that model and then you try and add 10,000 people to it, it doesn't work, right? You can't scale that up at the speed required to bring on all that resource, all that energy. What the Sanders campaign managed to do in the US, and to a degree what the Corbyn campaign managed to do in the UK during 2019, was to develop a mode of organizing that actively took all that additional resource and scaled up with it. So instead of really struggling to pull people in and leaving people with like nothing to do, it had this constantly escalating series of asks and a constant availability to get involved and do more things. So our theory was always just ask big, right? Like we need to ask people to do what is necessary to win this election. We need to share our plan with the movement. We need to share as much information as possible and to enable people to basically self-organize insofar as possible, because you can't centrally coordinate that kind of energy, right? And I think all of us from different movement contexts will kind of know that feeling of like when there's a huge upsurge and it cannot be controlled and it has to just run through whatever channels already exist, right? It was interesting when you're saying a lot of these organizations came out of the Corbyn leadership. I think actually probably all of us would recognize an earlier origin point than that in the student movement around 2010 in the UK, which was one such of those moments, right, where you had this huge surge of enthusiasm. We were fighting at the time £9,000 tuition fees being introduced. And basically, like when you get those moments of like complete mobilization where there's huge amounts of energy, how do you channel that most effectively? What happened in 2010 was students kind of self-organized, and it was a little bit chaotic, quite cool. We smashed up Tory HQ. We did some good stuff. We lost in the end, but it created all these interesting projects. What my campaign map attempted to do was turn that into electorally useful outcomes. So to give people an idea of how my campaign map worked, basically you'd go on there and you could put in your postcode and you get shown events and groups in your local area. So say if I put in Southeast London, I would get shown, here are all the canvassing events in the constituencies or the parliamentary areas around you. Here's the phone banking that's going on. Here's the WhatsApp group that coordinates everything that's happening in your area. Here's other forms of events. So if there was some kind of training, or at one point we put some picket lines on there so people could go and join picket lines and actively agitate there. And it just showed you the full buffet of everything you could get involved in. And when you said, okay, I'm going to go to this canvassing event, for instance, you get the details of that canvassing event, but then it could also push you into a WhatsApp group. So for the people who are organizing on the ground, they experience this really as, say you're a long-term activist and you're organizing on the ground in your constituency. Suddenly there's all these people who are really, really interested in doing electoral work, getting funneled into your WhatsApp. So basically the big organization is acting as like a big front end, and then it's channeling active, energized people into these local groups so they can do the work of canvassing and convincing people to vote Labour on the ground. We also operated that alongside a very large Slack-based infrastructure that would basically built volunteer teams to do all sorts of tasks. So I, for a large part of the general election, ran the back end, the kind of the support element of Momentum's campaign. So whenever we needed people to get in touch with us or people were having problems, we'd be their kind of resource. that was entirely volunteer run. And similarly, there were research teams that were entirely volunteer run as well. So the idea was to, as I said, just take that huge surge of energy and turn it into useful outcomes. And by and large, it worked by its own metrics. I mean, we're talking about 170,000 people, individual unique users, using my campaign map to find canvassing sessions, activity sessions near to them. So that's up 70% on the previous system that was implemented in 2017. But we also had a whole range of other programs, including like a thing called Labour Legends, which in retrospect, I don't think any of us would identify with that term now, given the recent turn of the Labour Party. But at the time, it was quite a nice term. People who are taking a week out upwards to campaign in the general election specifically. So we're talking about 1,800 people taking a full week of holiday leave to go and campaign and literally be sent around the country wherever we thought might need reinforcement. So often people were leaving London and getting sent to remote parts of Scotland or getting sent to, wherever there was a need. So my campaign map was the front end, the really friendly end of a massive campaign infrastructure that presented people with a plan, that shared with them what we needed to do, that basically presented a continually escalating series of asks, being like, we need to do everything to win this election. This is a vital turning point in British history. What can you do to help? And there was always something more you could possibly be doing, up to the point of becoming a Labour legend or one of the people who ran these volunteer teams on the back end. And it was, I think by and large, very effective. The crushing problem, of course, is that no matter how effective your digital campaigning infrastructure, it isn't a silver bullet, as Alex said. And you can have these kind of meta-political conditions which will determine results much more than the efficacy of any particular deployment of technology. But I think it was a really, really interesting example. I might try and find the plan to win, and we can put it in the chat maybe, and so people can see the kind of the front end of the plan and how people can engage with it.
That would be super, super cool. I also talked with Joe about, like, as far as I know, the My Campaign Map project is like open source and people can find the source code on GitHub. And I talked with Joe like a tiny bit about like, okay, this sounds like a rough structure that you could basically adopt for like multiple use cases, multiple contexts. So if anybody's watching who has any crazy idea about what to do with it, if we find it like quickly on GitHub and can post the link in the chat, like go for it and let us know what comes out of it. Thank you for that. What I didn't know was this, that it sent you into like also the, okay, how do these small local groups organize, for like, for example, a WhatsApp chat? Like that's super cool. That's not just, oh, you go there, but like you actually get like a step into what are these people doing on the ground. Then like to Gemma and Alex, you developed My Campaign Map back in the day, as far as I know. Can you tell us a little bit about that project from your point of view?
So I'll go and then I'll pass to Gemma for some extra comment. As Callum said, My Campaign Map was built off the success of a previous tool that was called My Nearest Marginal, that was part of the 2017 general election campaign. And essentially that tool had many of the similar kind of affordances that Callum's talked about. You kind of search for the thing, it kind of got your events, and then like kind of encouraged you to go to them, kind of like brought you into the campaign more generally. Of course, My Campaign Map was a kind of a more sophisticated version of this. Over the course of the campaign, like lots of different things were tried, found to be effective or less effective. For example, I don't know, like route finding, for example, like, how to actually get, not just like there are these events, but like how to get to the events. Also like giving people lifts to events, like, carpooling basically was a feature for a short amount of time. There was a lot of like density to it. And the work on it began with our now member, but then kind of just a kind of consultant for Momentum. But the early version of it was kind of built out by our member Jan, who went in early September, I think, to kind of like start off the work on this. to kind of go in, workshop it a bit with people. So, when we work with organizations, we always like to, really understand their context, understand what they want, what they need. And we, prior to that, in the summer, we'd actually had some conversations about, firstly, we'd had the conversation about what was the likely political outcome of the general election. And at least at the time, I personally thought it was going to be a horrendous defeat. So I'll just get that little thing in there right now. But nonetheless, we built a campaign map, and I think basically my kind of hypothesis politically was that the kind of meta political conditions were extremely unfavourable, and moreover, the kind of things that enabled the successes of the 2017 campaign were diminished in 2019. For example, the Conservative Party being a less effective campaigning organisation themselves. Anyway, so that's how we kind of built it out. In technical terms, just briefly, it is built on a kind of a standard stack that we use, that is now being actually encapsulated, and Gemma's just reminded me in direct message, in a kind of a technology framework that we're calling groundwork. And the idea of groundwork is to give campaigns to organisers like a 2-month head start build technology for campaigns. So when you're running a campaign, when you're doing organizing, you need data streams, you need mapping, you need these kind of things. And built off the back of our experiences during that time, and 2 years of subsequent working with grassroots organizers, we've kind of developed out this kind of form of technology, and it has many of the things within it that actually you could basically build My Campaign Map. It's a toolkit from which you could build a tool like My Campaign Map and others like it that are kind of organizing platforms in general. So I think that's the basics. I'm just going to pass to Gemma for some more thoughts on the campaign. We actually like Callum, because it was quite a difficult experience. I think that we've kind of not talked about it a great deal. But yeah, Gemma, do you want to say anything further about? We built some other tools as well, and maybe you could say a bit about those as well. That were quite cool.
Yeah. So alongside the campaign map, we were also building a whole lot of different things that kind of fed into it or complemented it, which also in retrospect, it was insane the amount of stuff we did in a really short period of time. But in some ways, kind of to your point earlier about the Copeland movement and also the student movement before that, it was so nice to work with all these people that we continue to work with today, basically just in different organizational forms and stuff. And I say it's kind of nice to have this meta team of people that can, that it can take all sorts of different formations, but you have those kind of relationships there to build upon. So anyway, the other tools that we were working on, there was one, My Plan to Win, which Callum mentioned. We also made a app website version of that, where it's basically an activist day planner, and it would feed you okay, so today you're gonna call 2 of your friends and message 5 of them and go canvassing and that kind of thing. And the idea being that you can feed these asks. If people do a lot, they get more things and more complex things, etc. It definitely didn't have the same reach as My Campaign Map, but I think it was a good proof of concept. And we've actually used this, we've built on the learnings from that and the idea with another organization called Zetkin, which is based in Sweden, and they work with the kind of far left parties in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And so we've kind of built an app version with a similar kind of concept. It's slightly different, but basically making it really fun and easy to do these tasks. And it feeds you just a couple every day and that kind of thing. So yeah, and same with groundwork and My Campaign Map. The learnings from the campaign, even though ultimately it was unsuccessful, have been upcycled into many other projects that we've worked on and built upon.
when you said like activist day planner, I just had to think about like TikTok, a day in the life of like a political activist, videos like that. And like,
it's mainly staring at spreadsheets, mainly like staring at spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Going on WhatsApp a lot, like typing on what, like basically, if you're typing on WhatsApp, it will be going on spreadsheets, like big Google Sheets, looking through stuff. It will be putting together emails on Action Network or similar platforms like
You'd be like
MailChimp.
tearing your hair out at Action
Like,
Network.
why does this HTML email look so terrible? Why? I can't believe we can't do these things. And then going to bed really very, very late, scrolling through your phone on on Twitter, basically. That's the essential day-to-day diet of a contemporary organizer, through which those methodologies help us, build radical power and eventually will lead us to a marvelous utopia. But in the day-to-day, they are somewhat mundane.
I guess I rather sort of like the same format, own meeting people who are like politically interested. More like whatever the tech companies, like all day just snacks and working out and none of the real work. Like only the good stuff is shown. And okay, enough of India. This is slightly a little bit different, but it kind of connects with like terms of like, okay, the database connection, research connection. So what really interests me is like, okay, how do you connect the research, the papers, in general, all of the research that Autonomy does with outside clients, outside players? Like, how do you choose the people to connect with? What are like your decision-making criteria? And like, I just figure it to be super difficult to mediate between like a political player and like a more scientifically focused research enterprise. Like, how does that look like?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of identifying kind of stakeholders or people we want to work with, often it will come through existing contacts. Kind of like Gemma was saying, there's a really good network of people on the left in the political organizing movement, left over from the past 5 years or so, 5-7 years or so. So either from existing contacts, especially since quite a lot of us in the same office building, you can kind of go down the corridor, knock on someone's door, or drop someone an email. And with that, we've hosted kind of presentations, webinars, explaining some of these new tools, so you can kind of share the information with a big group of people at once, and then people can come back to you from that. Otherwise, you can meet potentially interested people through your existing contacts. So once they've heard about your resources, they might then say, oh, like I was talking to this person, then connect you via that way. Again, our comms team is really good, fortunately. So we've got a good social media and also digital print, TV, radio communications teams. So I think our kind of a brand awareness, I suppose, of us has been raised quite a lot through that, particularly with the launch of the 4-day week UK trial back in June. Then that really kind of got our name in a lot of places, which was great. And the BBC did a big feature. So that was really valuable for kind of raising awareness of us. And also we had a lot of contact from people interested in trialing a 4-day week trial after that, just from that too, which was great. And I'd say the final way is probably kind of cold emailing people. So if we've developed a tool or got a research paper, then we'll normally do a bit of brainstorming around who it could be useful for. And then we'll do some research, get some emails and send some emails out, which is obviously less effective generally, because a lot of people won't want to respond to a random email in their inbox from someone they never heard of. But we have had some quite interesting conversations, particularly for like the jobs database. We've realized that it'd be quite useful for example, devolved administrations have now got control of adult education budgets. So they've got much more autonomy on what their skills and training programs are. So we can kind of give them information on skills in their area, and then they can kind of tailor programs to suit that, and also their political agendas too. And then in terms of the mediating, I suppose, it's kind of, as Alex said, kind of all of the projects we do are very quite iterative. We work very in tandem with the needs and the wants of the people we're working with. And most of the work we do is quite tailorable, I suppose, kind of, especially when it's data. Then there's a load of ways that you can pull that out and analyze that and present it, whether that's in a report format or a kind of quarterly summary of something. And it's the same with the 4-day week work we do as well. That's normally kind of pretty iterative in terms of there's no kind of one size fits all, I suppose, with any of this. It's, you have an introductory meeting, you present the general ideas, and then see how it would work for them, and you go from there. So, for example, with the 4-day week consultancy, we're talking to an organization at the moment who has a manufacturing branch, which is running 24/7, a distribution logistics branch, and also a retail branch, and lots of different types of contracts and lots of different hours across all of those. So it's just quite a drawn out process of talking to them, putting forward a design, getting their feedback, and working in that way.
Okay, I can kind of figure that how that kind of process is looking like with regards to talking to organizations, or maybe policymakers, whoever. How does it look like with grassroots unions or grassroots campaigns, maybe in general? Like, it seems, at least in my expectation, that the mediating process there looks quite more difficult, maybe, or quite difficult. Like, what are the usual challenges you come across in that process, and how are you coping with these challenges?
I think, yeah, you're right. It's definitely more complicated when organizations don't necessarily have huge budgets, don't have huge time resources, and also exactly shaping the work that we're doing to fit their needs when they don't necessarily even realize that they might what we have can add value to their work, can be a bit of a bridge to gap. So in terms of the matching kind of wants, needs, and abilities, it would be having again a lot of meetings, and also to realize kind of what skills they have and how the reports or the tools, what form they need to come in, kind of how advanced, like, can we give them a spreadsheet, or do we need to give them a full report, or do we need to give them an executive summary with some bullet points and the key messages, kind of what's the most important. And in terms of affordability, I think there's a couple of ways that we're getting around this. So either we can cross-fund the work that we're doing there, so particularly any income we're getting from private sector clients or the 4-day week consultancy, that might be able to kind of cross-fund the work we're doing with organizations that just can't afford to pay as much, if anything. And also there's always the opportunity for, within a network of organizations, that people could come together and pool their funding, and we can deliver, particularly if it's kind of data analysis at scale, we can deliver a much lower cost option. And that's happening with the web crawling, web scraping, because that's much easier to do. If we're kind of pulling a load of data off of Twitter, then we can analyze all of that for lots of different organizations, produce a quarterly report, and people don't have to pay very much individually at all over a longer period of time. But again, it's kind of, you don't want to fall into a bubble, I suppose. You don't want it just to be always the same people being able to use this data. And it's kind of breaking out of that is, yeah, definitely a bit of a challenge.
I guess that especially when like the contacts or clients are mediated, especially like at first from these already existing networks, then there is this danger of like, okay, you just bubble up kind of, and yeah, how do you reach out? Yeah, maybe as we are at like the topic of, okay, like how to pay for that work, and I mean, it's a challenge if you are making this stuff. You can't make it on a volunteer basis. Like, it's just yeah, to Gemma and Alex with regards to common knowledge, like how do you, like, what are the challenges in making the worker co-op financially sustainable so you can live off of it and still do politically useful work? How does that look like? What are the challenges that you regularly come across? And yeah, I think that's just an important question we have to ask ourselves on the left. Like,
yeah, it's definitely the biggest challenge, I think. Yeah, more than anything else. I mean, I think that running a small organization, a small business, is always hard. And then if you're trying to do it like within capitalism, under a Tory government, and you're trying to do it like in an anti-capitalist way that is like non-hierarchical and like working with grassroots organizers, et cetera, it's just like hard mode, super hard mode. So yeah, basically the answer is with great difficulty. But more concretely, so the bulk of our work at the moment is consultancy work. We have in the past had grant funding from a range of organizations, including RLS, National Lottery Fund during COVID, which was like a kind of COVID resilience grant. And so they have been really useful, but it's definitely, it's not sustainable for us to completely rely on that. We found particularly like the process of applying for grants when we're a really small organization, and particularly quite a naive organization when we started a few years ago, it just took us so much time to write these grants for like such little results. It was only the funds like Rosa Luxemburg that were already really aligned with what we're doing that would want to give us money. And so after a while, we were just like sick of it. Like, you know, consultancy work for us was more reliable. I think now we're kind of drifting more towards, okay, we'd like to do more grants and have a bit more of a kind of hybrid model while still keeping the consultancy stuff going. But yeah, I guess the concept, which works sometimes well, sometimes not, is that we do consultancy work. We charge a rate that organizations can afford, but also that covers our time and hopefully a bit more depending on the organization and like what their financial capacity is. And then with that surplus, we use that to kind of give discounts to the more grassroots organizations that can't afford to pay the same amount. So pretty much what India was saying. And yeah, this works pretty well. We probably need more of the organizations that can pay more though. And we're also really interested in doing more of this kind of work where you are kind of combining forces, combining budgets, everything, and solving something once and then customizing it. I think that can be a really good model as well. But yeah, Alex, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. I think like India said, it's that kind of slightly Robin Hood model, and I think that some of the bigger NGOs we work with, we do when we talk to them, when we're like, you know, they've got some particular like digital need that they want, we will explain to them that that's how it's working. How it's working is, you know, you are basically subsidizing the smaller groups to get the same like quality of stuff, you know, the same kind of like professional digital strategic pieces as you're getting, but for an organization that is, and obviously there are challenges with working with smaller organizations and bigger organizations, but that's the kind of idea, that's the approach. And the other thing, yeah, as Gemma said, like groundwork that we mentioned earlier is an attempt to take what we have learned, understand the gaps, and build them into essentially products. So like things, you know, there's a bunch of things that you can get off the shelf already that are kind of oriented towards you know, kind of organizing work. Action Network that I kind of joked about earlier is like one of the more well-known ones. They tend to be very US centric, and they tend also to be rather electoral politics centric. And one of our early things about Common Knowledge is, although we do work in elections because that's where a lot of political activity happens, our actual general concern is like in non-electoral politics. So more community groups, unions, other forms of building power outside the formal political sphere. So yeah, that's the kind of next generation we hope of Common Knowledge, which is to generalize our understandings into both kind of patterns and like trainings and those kind of things, but also kind of software artifacts, products, groundwork being, you know, one of the first takes on this, but hopefully to do more to kind of build this like next generation of kind of organizing tooling. Because at the moment, the tooling for organizing is like generally oriented towards broadcast, towards, you know, sending out emails essentially. There are very few tools that take seriously the kind of patterns of kind of power building that organizers do. You know, the basic skills of being an organizer, doing a one-to-one, having a large meeting, the kind of things that organizers have been doing in analog terms for, you know, at least hundreds of years, if not, you know, thousands of years. You know, people have always collectively built power to overcome, you know, overcome forces that are against them. And so I think that's like where we're kind of thinking. And yeah, the fundraising thing is very difficult, the kind of financial piece, because when you do kind of more infrastructural work, it takes a lot of kind of, people really have to understand why such things will be necessary. And sometimes they actually have to have done the work themselves in order to understand that there are those gaps, which, you know, those software gaps, those kind of training gaps that we can, you know, enable. Yeah, so that answers your question.
What I found interesting is there seem to be like these two commonalities now between like common knowledge and autonomy, which is this kind of like Robin Hood model combined with consultancy, and at the same time this point of, okay, reiterating on your own work you've done before and then like tailoring that to specific like clients and people you work with in the specifics. So these seem to be like, I don't want to come up with, oh, we now find like the new form of political organization. Like, no, but there is an interesting like commonalities, which maybe to identify key somewhat necessary characteristics of like, okay, what's necessary to run like a relatively small left organization that's active in this kind of maybe it doesn't even matter that much on maybe tech level, I don't know, but it just seems like an interesting pattern right there. Yeah. Now, Callum, because we talked so much about like the organization stuff and the funding stuff, I'm gonna give you some attention again. You said in a mail, in the mail exchange we had before, that you said you could also talk that you have experimented with like distributed communication methods after your time in Momentum, if I got that right. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I guess my Signal experience on this front is mostly in organising with platform workers. So as I said, when I first saw the platform strikes in 2017 in London, I was like very confused, right? I think a lot of onlookers were, because this was a workforce who had no physical workplace, had no like employment status, and didn't really meet together in any obvious place. And a lot of us, I think, looked at that workforce and were like, well, how do they organize? How is it at all feasible to organize under those circumstances? But now looking back 5 years on, I mean, you can look at any of the large international research projects on platform workers. We have substantial evidence that they are a very strike-prone set of workers, and that in fact, they're probably more strike-prone than your average worker in the formal economy, right? That's almost certainly true in the UK. Now, I think what we've really discovered over this period of time is how workers have jerry-rigged their own kind of means of communication and organization from below in these circumstances that are adapted to their particular conditions, right? So when I I got a job at Deliveroo and I started talking to people around the city, I found out that within the labour process, there are certain numbers of places where you would meet a lot of fellow workers, whether that be when you're waiting for orders downtown in like a zone centre was what they called it at the time. But basically, if you think about how a delivery platform works, you've got like a concentration of restaurants in a hub, and then you've got consumers kind of spread everywhere in the map, right? And then there's people constantly doing journeys backwards and forwards. So when there's a slack in demand for deliveries, everyone's going to reconcentrate in the centre, right? And whether it's formally constituted or not, everyone's going to concentrate in the areas where there are lots of restaurants. So if you think your experience, I mean, certainly in London, you go down any street where there's a hub of restaurants, and there'll be large numbers of delivery workers waiting at any one time. For Uber Eats, for instance, you do the vast majority of your deliveries, or you do in the UK, from McDonald's. So most Uber Eats workers wait in McDonald's when they're not working. So despite the absence of an obvious physical workplace, there are these accumulation points built into the system that are kind of unavoidable, particularly with the spread of dark kitchens, which we might call, like, it's basically the term for industrial estate based food production that's kind of delivery only. These kind of recreate exactly the same dynamics of like mass workplaces. So there are in real life channels. But then what's really interesting is that workers create what a scholar called Alex Wood has called mass self-communication networks, that they kind of structure over the top of these. So predominantly that's going to be WhatsApp networks, right? And it's one of the things that really, really stood out when I started getting involved in this work and studying it and organizing alongside platform workers, was that the WhatsApp network was like the basic organizational unit around which all these strikes were taking place. So it kind of like supplanted trade unions in many ways. They operated really as a strike network. So as you met people in real life at zone centers, in restaurant kitchens, at McDonald's, wherever, you would get added to these groups. And these groups would basically operate as mutual aid groups for most of the time. But then whenever conditions got substantially worse, they would often rapidly turn into mobilization networks. So say wages go down, wages get cut by 20% or something. This is not uncommon. The entire trend of the gig economy for most workers has been a constant downward spiral in real wages. Whenever that happens, you would get a lot of people very angry who would then have the capacity to coordinate. And because they didn't have employment status and the legislation surrounding employment status to restrict their freedom of action, they could very quickly decide, all right, collectively, we're all going to log off and we're going to do it tomorrow night, and we're going to have a huge amount of leverage and cause a big strike. So I think for me, one of the really, really fascinating things there is that workers themselves are taking these tools, which are not designed for this purpose, obviously, and generating out of them some very effective forms of organization, because basically it's just human sociality mediated through technological form, right? It's exactly the same thing you do with like a casual conversation around the water cooler, but scaled up and enabled in different ways. And actually, when you look back at kind of this post-Arab Spring period, I mean, none of us believe in Twitter revolutions anymore, right? That's very much a thing of the past. But I think a lot of people may be perhaps still very interested in many-to-many communications technology and the potential that that kind of mass messaging creates for certain forms of organization and action, right?
This is perfect, like, especially the point where, okay, hey, just the movement patterns of the simple network of the how the restaurants are placed and where you gather, and it's this mix of, okay, what are people actually doing with them, what kind of behavior is kind of how do you say that, demanded by the app, kind of, and how that relates to this or making possible or making much more likely this organizing effort is super interesting. I'm gonna come back to Alex and Gemma again, because I had this question to you. I'm going to try to formulate it a little bit more understandable in this right here. Do you make something like a systems diagram or map of like an organization, their activities, the environment of all of that, and we're basically, okay, this is the status quo, and now we have like a diagram. Oh, this is how we want to change it, with, like, for example, okay, hey, giving you a different tool or giving you some consultancy on, okay, we have like some ready-made tools and we teach you how to use it, etc. Like, do you start with kind of like, okay, we like do like I've seen the common knowledge logo is what springs into mind. I was like, systems mapping, like that's my first association with that. Is this something you do in basically the work you do with other organizations? And maybe are you using something like technical affordance theory or something like that? Like, what kind of theory influences you in your day-to-day practice in that?
Gemma, do you want to say this? Because I think the last couple of projects you've worked on have involved precisely a systems map of all the stuff they have.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely make maps of some form for pretty much every project. It's not always, the whole organization and trying to understand that, or like the whole system. I think partially because it's impossible to really get like an accurate map of that kind of thing. Like it compounds in kind of complexity, and I'm not sure how useful it would be. Although our colleague Jan is like, he is like the systems diagram guy. He's always making these really wild maps.
I need to get in touch with him, I think.
Yeah. He made one because we did, after the general election, we did as part of the kind of reflection processing, I guess, for Labour Together, we did like a kind of review of, we contributed specifically looking at their digital systems, but Jan also made like a org chart of the Labour Party, which is probably our most comprehensive one. It's online somewhere. But yeah, a lot of the time it's more mapping a process or a system that we're intervening into. And, this is fairly standard, I guess, in kind of design and technology projects where you're kind of like walking through what are all the different steps of the process, what's happening now, how could you change that, what do people need, etc. So yeah, I definitely think that it's like one of the core methodologies for us to kind of understand what we're doing. And yeah, we definitely think about the affordances of digital tools. I think Callum's example of WhatsApp is a really interesting one, because there are definitely affordances of WhatsApp that drive you a little bit crazy and are actually not very conducive to, definitely not to work-life balance and potentially not always to like successful political organizing either. But they do enable this kind of, decentralized network where like anyone can talk to anyone, you can have big groups and that kind of thing. And the other, apart from tools that are, designed specifically for organizing like Action Network, which is a whole other kind of ball game, a lot of the time people are using just off the shelf consumer tools, Google Drive, Airtable, that kind of thing. And yeah, there are definitely affordances within that that have to be worked around, this kind of more one-to-many broadcast. Yeah, I mean, Alex can probably talk a bit more about this as well.
Yeah, I'll just briefly. I think the kind of mapping thing's really interesting because, I think that, well, certainly one of the political traditions that I'm influenced by is what Callum mentioned earlier, which is, and also Autonomy as an organization are influenced by this kind of like, the movements of the 1960s and 70s in Italy. And workers' inquiry was one of the aspects of those movements. And I think it's quite interesting because one of the things that they used to do in the 70s was they used to, and there's various accounts of how successful this actually was or wasn't as a tool for enabling political struggle, is what they would do is map the factories. So they would get a diagram of the factories, and they would like basically show where the workers came in, and they would show where where there were kind of like moments where kind of lots of workers interacted and so on and so forth. And it's quite interesting when Jen was speaking, I was thinking like, in a way, because life is so increasingly digitized, these kind of process diagrams that show how the kind of data flows and also the people kind of interact are kind of a form of that kind of mapping to enable political change that comes from that particular tradition. But yeah, I think the only thing to add to what Gemma said was it's very difficult to capture these things in a kind of static map, because of course they are dynamic. They are dynamic changing systems, and some of the stuff that we're doing is deliberately intervening in them to reshape them. And although I like, a process diagram as much as anyone else, I think that sometimes they lead one to a kind of like static theory of how the world works, when actually the whole thing about like political change is it is dynamic. And I think that sometimes people forget that there's interactions between forces, there's kind of a wider ecology, so on and so forth. I think that whereas diagrammatizing things is really cool, and I definitely love a big diagram, it does lead to a certain image of thought that might lead one astray when thinking about dynamic things like political contestation, large-scale social change, and so on.
I just said with the last point of, okay, hey, when you have like a diagram just like laying in front of you, and it kind of like, okay, this represents the thing that you're interested in, and it's very difficult to imagine, okay, like we want to actually change like at least like a significant part of this, and in this written down or just represented thing, it's not intuitively presented to even the possibility of that. But yeah, I remember some of this on Autonomy's website, some of these like, I think these diagrams with like, okay, here a workers meeting in the workplace, and they all look like super modern, cool, digitalized. And I need to look into what I want to ask you, because like this seems to be something that like India, like autonomy and common knowledge, at least like on an abstract level, have in common with like, okay, you also with the outreach work, with the research work that Autonomy is doing, like you go to stakeholders, to clients, and like you also want to kind of intervene into their process and change some, like make them work more effective, like augment their capacities, however you want to call it, a little bit different than common knowledge does. But are you doing like inter-organizational, like kind of methodological knowledge sharing in there, where you say like, okay, you go into kind of like a meeting, share your experiences with, we use this method, this had this outcome, etc. Is there like anything like that happening?
I think definitely when it's relevant, absolutely. I think particularly in the kind of initial brainstorming sessions, those can be really useful, especially as if an organization is kind of unclear of what the next steps are in terms of either using one of our tools, getting involved in some of the research, or even with the 4-day week work, then saying, well, actually in this place we did this model suited them really well and they're similar to you. That can be really valuable. And I think actually it builds a lot of confidence too. So for example, if we're talking again with the consultancy work, if like a retail company comes to us and they're like, we can't really see any other retail companies doing this, there aren't many taking part in the trial, is this even really possible for us, is it just going to be really complicated, and like we're not office based, and all the usual doubts come, like can we really be 20% more productive each week? Then if we say, well, actually we had this experience with another similar organization, and yes, it absolutely is possible, then definitely I think it's definitely a really useful way of working.
I can imagine that that's simply the authority of having like a reference case of like, hey, you're not the first ones to try this, is quite helpful, I guess. Let me give me like a short minute. Yes, the transform your work toolkit. It was just sent into the chat that there is this so-called transform your work toolkit. Let me really quickly post, or Cassie, can you post it into the YouTube chat? That would be perfect. I think that's actually like I watched that back in the day, like last summer, the launch event of the transform your work toolkit, and that's where I came across common knowledge for the first time. So it dates back that long, and now we're here.
So yeah, it's an interesting example, because this was a kind of a collaboration between all the kind of people that are in this chat, because Autonomy did the research aspect of that, like looked into the various techniques, and Callum's organization, Notes from Below, is obviously a kind of repository of some of the kind of historical examples of this. And what we spend the time doing is thinking about how these techniques operated and trying as hard as possible to make them really, really simple, because we wanted to remove the kind of jargon around these kind of things, and explain them as simply as possible, so that the idea of the website, which is transform your work, transform your .work. That was I've got that domain name. I was very pleased. Yeah, I think it's really important. It was really important to simplify things, and try and create a guidebook basically that you could kind of pick off the shelf and use it. Gemma, do you want to say more, because you did most of that kind of copy work?
I mean, I'm not sure there's that much else to say. We were breaking things down into step-by-step processes, also including the tools that you can use, like examples of tools, and then backing them up with historical examples as well. Hey. But yeah, that's it.
The dog is derailing the pen.
Sorry, he just wanted to cuddle, so I brought him up.
That's completely legitimate. That's completely fine. One of the things that I told you on earlier, I mean, you obviously know each other quite well, was that, okay, do you have any questions, any kind of cross comments about each other's work, each other's organizations, or just maybe some, I mean, ideas emerge in stupid ways, for example, a panel discussion that you just want to throw out there. Just I mean, not only now the possibility is, but all over, but just a reminder of, and giving a short space, and also then I have more time to watch for a new question to ask, but
Can I ask Callum a question? Which is, I'm really interested about the AI stuff that you're doing. Can you talk a bit about that? What you're researching?
Well, it's going to be about the dog. I was hoping it was about the dog.
Oh no!
His name's Pudding.
What type of dog is that?
No, so the AI stuff, it is really interesting. So what we're doing is the Oxford Internet Institute hosts a project called Fairwork, which is fair.work, which is also a good domain name. And Fairwork was originally initiated as basically a gig economy monitoring project. So the idea was to draw up a set of principles about what constituted fair work, and really the concept of fair here is being used as a directional concept, right? Not an absolute, right? So what is the fairer end of platform work? And then measure how far platforms are reaching or not reaching that threshold, and then give them scores out of 10, basically. So there are a load of points. 1 point being, is the pay minimum wage? You get 1 point. Is the pay living wage? You get another point. That kind of stuff repeated for a whole series of platforms. And the data was gathered through basically worker interviews and also discussions with management. And you'd get this adversarial data gathering model. It's quite heavily influenced by Works Inquiry. Jamie Woodcock, who was my PhD supervisor, is a co-editor at Notes and Below, and has done a lot to revive the Works Inquiry in the Anglophone world. Was very involved with it at the start. Now that project has now spread massively. It's almost 40 countries now, I think, we rate gig economy platforms. So we're talking thousands of platforms rated, thousands of workers interviewed, and sometimes really, really significant impacts with platforms across the world. So, you'll go into discussions with management around, some particular issue, say, what the insurance is like. Is there enough insurance for accidents or whatever? And you'd be amazed at how often actually under pressure from civil society, under pressure from organized workers, under pressure from a whole range of ecosystem of actors, these platforms are really interested in some ways in making minor concessions. So I often think we act as a kind of concession advisory service, being okay, you want to concede a load of points to your workers here, 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 and here. That's a good place to start. But we're the friendly face, so they do it to us. But it's a project that very much avowedly is about producing positive change for workers and cooperating with trades unions and organised groups of workers to do so. So that is the kind of the gig economy side of the project. What I'm doing currently is I'm working on the AI side of that project. So basically looking at how can we apply a relatively similar model to monitor, instead of just one specific sector of the economy, how can we monitor the rollout of AI technology to workplaces? So to do that, we're working with a global partnership on AI, which is a big 25-country consortium research body that basically has a lot of money to splash around doing interesting AI research. So we're developing a set of principles now, which will then function as our kind of scoring principles in the future. And the idea would be to, basically try and get a handle on the development of AI technology in the workplace. So rather than developing our own tools, this is very much about monitoring what's going on the other side and attempting to both influence people trying to form regulation and also get trade unions the knowledge they need to react to this stuff. Because it is really, I think, quite a very interesting frontier, because many workplaces, right, if you introduce, take a historical example, right, if you introduce machine tools to a workshop in order to reduce the skill level required to operate and produce, let's say, steel parts in that workshop, right, the workers who are undertaking that work often have a very intimate understanding of the technology they're using, and may often, in fact, understand it because they use it every day much more than their bosses do, right? But the potential of some AI technology and certain forms of internet technology, of information technology in general, is that they can be black boxed to the people who bear the brunt of them. So often, when I'm talking to trade unionists about this project, and we're working on the final draft now, we've done lots of interviews with people from a variety of trade union contexts. They'll talk about, for instance, the way that a hiring algorithm was brought in to shape the way in which hiring was done in the workplace, but nobody really knew it had been brought in. Nobody understood the impacts it could have, and it started producing, negative outcomes, because AI essentially is just a large statistical program, and it reproduces whatever pattern it's been trained on. And if it's been trained on a pattern that's been derived from our society, it will produce all exactly the same patterns that exist in our society. But often the level of knowledge and understanding isn't there. So the idea is to create like a monitoring project, a scoring project that tries to hold that to account, to measure global spreads, to identify key emerging issues, to empower trade unionists to work on things, to empower regulators to understand what they're facing and regulate. And really, I think one of the reasons this is so necessary is because AI technology is profoundly, like you were saying, you're trying to take the jargon out of workers' inquiry methods. If there was ever a field that needs the jargon taken out of it, it's probably AI. Right? You have like major figures at Google saying that artificial general intelligence, which can just do anything and like think like a real human, is, I mean, we saw that weirdo engineer who fell in love with his own program, right? This kind of thing is like really widespread and really challenging when you're working in this space, because people don't really understand what AI is or what it does. And I'm a sociologist, I'm not a computer engineer, I'm not a software engineer, I don't build these programs, I don't understand how they work on the most fundamental level, but they're not actually that complicated, and really they function as like significant large forms of information technology that do cool things with data and pattern recognition and the relationship between multiple nonlinear variables, but they're not that complicated, right? So the goal is to dig down to these issues and kind of empower people to or primarily organized workers to understand and bargain over the conditions under which this technology is introduced to their own workplaces.
Well, one question I'd have, because this seems super interesting. The working together with, for example, unions. How is that institutionally organized? Is that through the Oxford New Internet Institute, or is that
so currently
yeah,
they're just interview subjects, right? So okay. They're interviewees. But in the future, we're just getting more rounds of funding. I mean, we've been talking about money throughout this whole thing, but we're just getting more rounds of funding now through grant funding to support us to basically develop this further. So we're going to do, hopefully next year, a series of in-depth case studies with either cooperatives or trade unions, looking at the implementation of the principles in a workplace and trying to measure some of the outcomes and see what it changes around how AI is used and what some of the outcomes workers experience are, and demonstrate, much as India was saying, like demonstrate a positive case here that like, look, you can comply with all these standards of fairness and still use AI. We're not saying the technology has to be thrown in the bin, but like this is how you do it responsibly. So we're looking at developing those kind of cooperative relationships going forward. I mean, obviously it's very difficult. Like there's I think a lot of people working in university environments, there's often there's tensions with working with organizations that are fundamentally about representing their members. I think as academics, we have to be hyper aware of like not using other organizations as like interesting research cases and not contributing to them. And this is where I think kind of fundamentally the ethics of workers' inquiry can show us something, right? Like the logic of the workers' inquiry is that the point of the research is to advance workers' struggle. The point of research is to push forward collectively workers' demands and understanding of their own workplace and increase their leverage. It's not necessarily to get you a tenure track job at some fancy university, right? So for academics, I mean, we have had a 30% pay cut over the last 20 years in the UK, but we fundamentally have to kind of sublate our interests to those of people in the workplace facing the brunt of this stuff. So I'd say there is a potential tension there in the relationship between the two, but any academic worth their salt, any person who's kind of genuinely interested in these issues, you've got to try and negotiate those with the interests of people outside your organization kind of uppermost.
Could I just jump in? Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And on Friday I got access to DALL-E, so I spent the entire like a Friday morning just playing with that. And I think this relates to some of the work that Autonomy are doing, where they're kind of looking at like the kind of jobs market and looking at kind of automation and kind of how those kind of things are shaped. So I guess it's really what was incredible too. There's this kind of tier of like, I guess there's a tier of like the kind of platform economy that is kind of like small kind of piecework, digital design, coding, these kind of things. And increasingly those kind of things, like, you know, I don't know, developing an album cover or doing a kind of like tiny bit of like editing, like an AI finds those kind of things trivial. You put the prompt in, you continue to like work through it, and you can get something that looks pretty good. And I think that was like, I mean, people have mentioned it before, but I think that there is going to be a reshaping of some aspects of the platform economy, less the kind of physical like logistics kind of thing, but more the those kind of design services to some extent that people do, and equally stuff like copywriting, like stuff like copywriting stuff, like even coding. Like engineers have always like positioned themselves with this arrogance that like we do this amazing thing, but if you've sat with GitHub's Copilot, or Microsoft's Copilot I should say, and use that, it's quite uncanny, particularly because the most of the coding that coders do is just gluing API A to API B and, you know, sitting in a big chair and drinking a nice Coke. Like that's basically most of engineers' jobs. And I'm someone who used to work in startups, so I fully know that. So I'm wondering, India, are you seeing any of this kind of AI stuff in the kind of the jobs research that Autonomy are doing?
I think we haven't really looked into it specifically yet, but we definitely want to, because I think particularly with the jobs database where each job role can be broken down into tasks, then we'll be able to kind of subjectively at least identify which tasks would be more vulnerable to automation, and then as a result of that you can say, well, actually 5% of this job role is likely to be 15%, 20%, which could be a really useful tool for how you frame automation for good as well, because it really plays into the shorter working week and working time reduction. It's like, oh well, 20% of my role is going to get automated in the next 5 years, therefore I don't need to work that 20% of my time anymore, which is really, really promising, but obviously, yeah, also a huge risk depending which way it goes. And we've also kind of released a report maybe a month ago on micro work as well, just as you were talking about, Alex, with all of the tiny bits of work. And as a sector, it is really precarious already, kind of. It's as you would have expected with the gig economy, very quite atomized. People are on these platforms, but aren't necessarily, at least superficially, able to talk to each other. People are being paid very little for the tasks, and it's just very people are quite vulnerable. So it would be it's definitely interesting to see how it goes forward, but also potentially concerning.
Well, the interesting thing with the micro work world, right, is that a lot of this stuff, so less the kind of Fiverr design an album cover style work, but the kind of Mechanical Turk work, is that actually artificial intelligence is just aggregated human intelligence. And often the humans producing that intelligence are being paid ridiculously low amounts of money. And when you look at like what parts of the world is this labor being done in, it's concentrated almost exclusively in the parts of the global labor market where wages are lowest, right? So you're really talking about, there's a fantastic example from Phil Jones' work without the worker of a startup that attempted to do kind of humanitarian work by introducing micro work to refugee camps, where people could work for like 10 cents for 15 jobs, and just work all day and make $2 or $3. And that was, you know, a fantastic humanitarian intervention. But it's true that the supply chain of AI is hugely embodied, is made up of people, not just in the form of like lithium mining or GPU manufacture or whatever, but actually whenever you are getting a set of training data, getting it labeled, feeding it to an AI and producing an outcome, you are not, that labeling is not immaterial, right? There are certain human beings whose intelligence gets turned into this stuff. And often it's, you know, very damaging. If it's, for instance, TikTok's algorithm that attempts to recognize animal abuse, a human being has to sit through and watch thousands of clips of animal abuse or potential animal abuse and label them as such, right? So when we see a lot of these outcomes that are thought of as just being, oh, immaterial, and isn't it cool, the AI can do this, the AI by and large can't do that. A human being did it, the AI can reproduce it, right? And this is the thing, that because fundamentally, I mean, we can get into arguments about what is sentience here, because AI can never produce fundamentally new outcomes, it can just work with data it's already being fed. Anything that the AI does is being done by a human, just at a different point in time, right?
I think we lost Gemma for a second there. This is perfect. This is kind of like exactly what I see as like my role as like the conversation organization facilitator, which is I bring people together and you just start chatting among. My role has like legit been automated in this. No, this is.
Well, this would usually just be me and Alex going backwards and forwards on WhatsApp. So we're just doing it in the real.
Hi, Gemma. Good to have you back. I was already like, why isn't she blinking? And I was reminded of that new Joe Biden video where he isn't blinking one time. That has been gone.
I mean, I think the thing about AI is, I was actually thinking about, and this is kind of bringing it back to the kind of political like organizing. I was actually thinking, I had like a day off. Oh, by the way, we work a 4-day week as well, so like, you know, big up. Although it's sometimes hard to work a 4-day week. Just let's just put it that way. There's a lot to be done, but try and keep disciplined on it. But I was wandering around and I was thinking like the next election campaign, the next general election campaign will potentially be in the UK or wherever it is, will be the AI election campaign. It will be the election campaign where we get the first deployment at scale of AI doing things like writing copy, like deepfake videos potentially, you know, doing analysis, like all these kind of technologies already exist. And I was just thinking that is actually quite terrifying. And I don't
it's so interesting, because you could like, so already in the last general election, the Tories had like these very targeted social adverts, right? Where they'd categorize potential voters into different streams and then feed them different kinds of messaging. And this is the kind of stuff that started with the Brexit campaign, but they got better at it basically. But it's true, Alex, you could almost, so AI can, for instance, I know some engineers who work on AI in advertising, that basically their role is to qualify leads based on behavior, right? So whether you hover over something or whether you click on something or whether you buy it now or buy it later or add it to a wish list or do whatever, basically it takes these kinds of behaviors and groups human beings into basically customer types, right? So I'll say the AI has developed 5,000 customer types, of which all the people in that type will display roughly the same kind of behavior. And as it kind of analyzes you, it will add you to a certain type, and then you will receive a particular experience tailored to your behavior, right? That's where advertising technology is right now, which is a significant advance really on where we were in 2019. So I think you're completely right. It'll be very interesting to see when you've got an AI that can, for instance, identify these 5,000 streams out of raw data, and then also develop micro-targeting approaches. You don't even need to have a human being designing the advert and the copy and the rest of it. You could actually just fully automate. And because you can automate that content production, you can actually increase the complexity of how many different kinds of groups you are. You could micro-target people who are of a certain age, with a certain behavior on a website, with a certain interest in news stories about immigration, with a certain interest in cars, and then bang, they can get specific content directed at them, which raises a question of like fundamentally the interoperability of the public sphere, right? Like, to what degree is this the same election campaign being conducted everywhere, or to what degree is it a technologically enabled parallel stream of like lots and lots of different elections being conducted at the same time, which has always been true to a certain degree, but maybe we're talking about an increase in scale here.
Yeah, just one thing. Sorry, India.
I was just going to say, and what do you think the cost implications of that would be? Go back to money. Do you think it's a question of, the Tory party would have more money than the Labour Party and therefore be able to use it? Or do you think it would come down to the Labour Party potentially having more qualms about the morals of using it?
The Labour Party would not be able to do that. The Labour Party, like internally, digitally in Southside, would not be capable of doing that, would not be capable of doing half of it. It was very, very unable to do things under the Corbyn period. And my understanding it's gone significantly backwards since then. So no, the Labour Party would not be able to do that. The Tory Party would be able to pay someone to do it using someone else's AI, basically. So like you just rent out software as a service, a large AI, and then teach it to do some of this stuff.
Yeah, I'm just going to get in and just say one thing, which is that like the good news is that kind of targeting advertising actually seems to have diminishing returns in general election campaigns. And I was actually part of the process of producing the Labour Together report, but someone else who worked on the Labour Together report that wasn't in our organisation actually talked to a Tory strategist about their targeting. And the Tory strategist basically said that they thought that like the bottom had basically fallen out of kind of that kind of targeted advertising, broadly speaking, and they were finding it less and less effective. And that kind of speaks to a wider issue in technology, which is in general, the kind of bottom is falling out of the kind of attention economy advertising paradigm in general. Facebook, Google, which has worrying implications for free software on the internet, free like Gmail, etc. But is the kind of direction of travel? This is why Silicon Valley is so interested in NFTs and all that jazz, is because they see the diminishing returns of the advertised, targeted, partly because people hate it. Back to you, Eric.
Yeah, really wanting to get this a little bit back again, focused on your organization activity. I think something that's like you already mentioned, Alex and Gemma, that like, okay, you're a non-hierarchical worker co-op. I think one of the most interesting questions to people who are watching is really, okay, what is like the rough internal structure of your organizations? I know Gemma and Alex said like you on your website, is it in an article? I don't even remember where I read it, but that you're using sociocracy as like a method for internal decision making. And maybe you could go into that like a little bit. But then I would also be interested in like what maybe then you share with common knowledge, what Autonomy shares with common knowledge, where there may be, as far as I understand, like Autonomy is like a good chunk bigger than common knowledge in terms of staff, as far as I know. So maybe how the internal structure and decision making is looking there. Yeah.
So sociocracy is a framework not just for making decisions, but also for internal governance. But the governance side of it, which is about having these kind of interlocking circles that are responsible for different areas that kind of fit back into a wider kind of general organizing circle. Because there are 5 of us, it doesn't make so much sense to do. But it is a really good organization. I'm sure like when we scale, we're definitely going to use something like that, because it's a way of having these kind of decentralized organizations that are non-hierarchical and that people have autonomy while still kind of talking to the collective at the same time. But yeah, the decision-making part, which we use, every day, the core idea behind it is that you're making decisions not on consensus, like everyone has to 100% agree with a proposal, but on consent, as in if someone makes a proposal, you know, I listen to them, and as long as it's not going to ruin my life or completely like change the way I'm working or whatever, I say, yeah, that's okay, fine, whatever. And so like there are kind of two ideas. Well, firstly, the kind of framework for making these decisions is it good enough for now and safe enough to try? And the kind of underlying concept of that is to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about earlier about being, I guess, like iterative organizations focused on like learning and reflection, feedback loops, etc. It's this idea that like you can make a decision and it's just a decision for now, and then you can see what happens and then have another discussion and make another decision. And yeah, we just find it a really kind of effective way of organizing, because I think all of us have had experience in previous organizations where you can just get so stuck trying to find something that works for everyone. And obviously there needs to be an element of democracy, and people shouldn't, like, everyone should have their voices heard, and also be listened to, etc. But there are some decisions that it just makes so much more sense to move quickly and to try things out and to experiment with things rather than sitting in meetings for 5 hours trying to, you know, decide on one thing. And I think another side of this is that it really empowers anyone to kind of make these iterations to the organization. Like, we encourage everyone as part of kind of coming into common knowledge and working with us to, like, yes, you can also make these proposals and you can change the organization fundamentally, and we'll listen to you. So it's kind of core of our culture in that respect as well. Yeah, India.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard of sociocracy. So yeah, definitely interesting to hear about. Thank you, Gemma. So Autonomy, we are larger probably in terms of the number of personnel involved, but not that many of us are full-time. There's only a few of us that are full-time. Most people are part-time, either doing PhDs or just working in on other things. So like our comms lead, Joe, then he is the campaign director for the UK 4-Day Week campaign as well. So we're also quite decentralized, I suppose. We're not all in London. There's only a few of us in London. Some people are elsewhere in the UK. Some people are international more generally. So as a result of that, we kind of can end up being, just much more decentralized into our individual teams. So we've got the data unit, we've got the urban team, we've got the consultancy team, we've got the design team. And that's all the teams. And there's probably like 2 or 3 people working in each of those. And we have weekly meetings where everyone comes in and catches up. And we also kind of every few months will try and have an in-person kind of team day where we kind of reflect on things and discuss things and plan the next few months out. We've also got quite a large network of academics and researchers as well. I think Callum is technically in that network. So that's kind of tens of people are in that network, and either people we've worked with previously, kind of collaborating on reports together, or are people that we will get in touch with if something is coming up and they've got a particular area of expertise. But they'll be listed on our website, for example, but we don't necessarily work with them every day. So we're not horizontal either. We are kind of somewhat hierarchical. We've got the layer of directors, and then we've got kind of the work stream leads, and then there's everyone else. But I think it is partly because, not to justify it, but partly because of we've got a lot of people part-time. Basically everyone is part-time bar 3 people. So it kind of lends itself more to certain people to having more responsibility in name and in practice, I suppose.
That like especially the last part with relating of course to financial sustainability of the organization, and then do you do part-time, how much decision-making capacity, like governance rights do you have? Like, it sounds like a big challenge, like probably nothing where you have ever really found the solution, but something you always try. I get, like, something that I've been asking myself is, especially, like, how do you like when you found such an organization, of course there will be like a core of people who are like the founders, and that that not just because they are the founders, they forever over the course of the organization will basically have be the main source of power and decision making. And yeah, everybody else is just kind of like, yeah, they're part-time, they kind of trickle in over time. And so maybe this is something that relates to another question that I've asked. I wanted to like also both of you, like Alex, Gemma, and India, like if you say, okay, if somebody watches this stream and they say this live stream and say, okay, the work these people do sounds super cool. I'm also at a career crossroads and I want to do something like that myself, but I want to found something myself in that kind of area. What would you say are like the biggest mistakes to avoid, but also the most essential things or the most important things to follow? Like just roughly some kind of rule of thumbs right there. What tips would you give these kinds of people?
So it's worth saying that people email us quite often, like asking exactly this kind of thing that you say. Like technology people will email us and say, I hate my job. I feel that it's not fulfilling. I'm wasting my life. Like, I want to do something that changes the world, that, you know, helps, you know, the ecological situation or whatever. And so there are a lot of people out there that kind of want to make these changes and transitions. I guess, you know, I think there's kind of like three things that typically we always say to people, and we always try and make time for people who want to have these conversations. There's like work out, you know, what you roughly want to do. Yeah, and work out like some kind of impression about how to make it financially sustainable. So that might be like, you know, for a lot of organizations, it'll be like, we're going to be a membership organization. You know, we're going to have like an equivalent of Patreon, or it might be, we're going to just bid for grants, or we're going to have like some grant consultancy hybrid, or however that kind of thing. And it's kind of boring, but it's pragmatically, that's how organizations unfortunately do have to work under capitalism. The second thing is to think about the kind of legal structure that you want. So, you know, thinking about like kind of a legal formation, obviously, depending on where you are, this might be different, but in the UK, a kind of very common one is a company limited by guarantee. It's essentially like a legal formation that you can have, and you can basically not have shared capital, which kind of makes you kind of a soft non-profit, basically. And the final thing, which is probably maybe the most important thing, is like work out how you're going to make decisions, work out how you're going to manage conflicts, how you're going to manage difference of direction, difference of opinions, how you're going to kind of work out the basics, like the pace, you know, the pay structures, the review structures, those kind of things are really, really important. You know, you can do what we did, which is like choose an off-the-shelf kind of decision-making tool, but you shouldn't underestimate how much, if you know, you don't necessarily have to want to be in a horizontal organization, but if you are going to go down that line, you need to remember how much kind of work on yourself you're going to have to do, because, you know, the defaults in contemporary capitalism are not to work in a cooperative, non-hierarchical manner. They are to exercise power over others. They are to boss people around. I've had to do a lot of work on myself in order to do some of these things, to listen clearly, to communicate. And I think that those are the things that are the hard things. I'm going to pass to Gemma.
Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, because it's different to what I would say to people if I talk to them. But I think we complement each other. Yeah, I mean, I would say that like the number one most important thing is like communication, because it's how you build trust. And yeah, I just think learning really early on how to communicate with each other clearly and non-violently and all the time is really, really important. And like to be able to give each other honest feedback and make changes based on that feedback, etc. I think another one is really having a shared vision and purpose, although that can change over time, but knowing where you're going, I think, is like really, really important. And like all the other stuff in a way like falls out of that. Like you can learn and work it out, etc. But like you need to have this kind of vision of the world that you're working towards. When we first started, before we went full time, we spent a few days at Mayday Rooms, actually, in London, which is this like radical archive, which is like very inspiring, and just like thinking of like, okay, what is like our vision and mission and that kind of thing, and like being able to have those conversations with people, I think, is really important. And then I think the final thing for me is like,
I think we lost Gemma again. Okay. Oh, you have been like, yeah, you've been like dropped out of like for 2 seconds, 5 seconds or something.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, no, just the last thing I would say is like making internal power structures like really clear and visible. I think that even in non-hierarchical organizations, there are going to be power structures. But if you're able to talk about them, talk about when they're a problem, rotate them if you can, and like hold each other accountable to things, I think that's really important. A really good reference for this is this short essay called Tyranny of Structurelessness. Which just talks about kind of organizing these groups and making things visible and that kind of thing. But yeah, India, I'm keen to hear your take.
I guess mine is more from if it's like an individual looking to join a pre-existing organization, I suppose. Pretty straightforward, I guess. I'm not going to say anything particularly new or revolutionary, but I would definitely not be afraid of like reaching out to people. Autonomy does get a lot of email requests saying, oh, I've got this experience, I'd love to join you. And although we don't have time to meet everyone in person, if someone's got the relevant skill sets, then we will have a meeting with them and we will remember their name, for later down the line. I think it's also, don't underestimate the amount of time it might take to kind of build a map of the different organizations you might want to reach out to. I think it's very easy when you're inside the bubble to obviously name all the different organizations that are relevant. When you're coming in from the outside, you might be able to find one, but then not know who they're working with. So maybe if you could even like ask an organization that you know exists for other similar organizations that they work with, just so you know the broader number of different organizations that are there. And I would say, don't underestimate the value of your unpaid time as well. Not everyone has time to do volunteering or to do activism outside of their paid work, but I think remembering that work is extremely important. And even if your paid work is in a leftist or kind of more radical organization, doesn't mean that just because you're not being paid for work, if you're not, that that's not helpful as well. It's almost more important as well. Like if you can, then definitely do that, and you will build skills and build connections and all sorts of things through doing that too.
So you heard people reach out to Autonomy. There's no, specifically the last thing you said with regards to, okay, hey, it's probably just there are different limitations and possibilities of like, okay, work unpaid, volunteer, like there just cannot possibly be like a paid base mass movement work. Like that's just structurally impossible. That just has to be voluntary. But at the same time, we also realize, okay, hey, we all like, if you really want to sustainably put time, energy, and maybe actually like some kind of capital, because you need some stuff to work with, into work that helps this kind of work that then is voluntary, which is kind of like what we assembled here today, the people are doing. You also need like that paid work in order so you can even have the time, energy, and survival that you can do it. So it's just different roles, and they are not, this fits perfectly into like my last question, which I actually sent every one of you, which is simply this: what do you think is your work or your organization's role in the overall ecology of the left? And I don't know, you all probably have this horizon of the UK left specifically. if it's going to be just the horizon of the UK left, okay. If you want to go further than that, you're very welcome to do so. I would invite Callum if you wanted to start. Yeah, I think this is the question we should all ask ourselves.
Yeah, well, I guess I've got kind of two different hats, right? So what's the role of Nurture Below? I mean, I think the point is still to attempt to like create that connection between the socialist movement and the workers' movement, and try and make that connection as strong and vibrant as possible, and to do so through workers' inquiry primarily, and to do this kind of like strategic investigation and research in particular sectors. So like something we're going to be launching very soon is strike reports. There are a lot of strikes kicking off in the UK now. We've basically created a very simple Airtable to pull in 400, 500 word strike reports from lots of different people around the country. So we just want to get loads of those in and start accumulating those and archiving them and sharing them backwards and forwards across people on different picket lines, whether they be train drivers or teachers or whoever's going to go on strike next. So I guess that's Nurture Below's role. What's my role in the Oxford Internet Institute? I don't know. It's like surviving in the belly of the beast almost. Yeah, I think for a lot of people in academia, there is definitely like very useful things you can do for the left, but you're not really working in an organization of the left. You're essentially in a, you're very much part of the reproduction of capital. So there are challenges for how you do that. I think articulating research outcomes in ways that are of value to actors outside of academia is probably the best way to do that, and to always try and make sure your research is kind of guided by that spirit of workers' inquiry I mentioned earlier.
Thanks. I specific, like, I think what speaks to like the most people in the audience is specifically the last part with if you happen to be in academia, make the best out of it, search for other organizations, actors that you can actually be useful to, which, I mean, let's be honest, most of us who are in academia and identify as left, like this is our internal drive. Like we want to work and be serviceable to these people, but like a lot of times it's just a lot of don't know how, or the institutional barriers or whatever. Like a lot of stuff can go wrong, but maybe organize with each other, like talk about what are the obstacles to that. Yeah.
Just in terms of like what academics could do, a lot of academics could do from just like going out and doing some real organizing in the real world, and like go out and like join a trade union or become like a supporter of a trade union that you're not even part of the workforce, right? And like go to their picket lines, go to their strikes, see how they work, see how things happen. Because if you've done this like progression from undergrad to masters to PhD, you spend a lot of time separated from like the conditions of life for the vast majority of society. So we kind of need to like every now and again take a slight bath in like what the world is actually like, what the movements for change that are actually fighting for a better world look like, how they operate, and just put ourselves at their service.
Whoever wants to go, I couldn't agree more, but whoever wants to go next, yeah, free to do.
Should I jump in? I'd say for autonomy, we again kind of have two different potential roles for the left. So the newest one is the data and analytical capability that I've been discussing. We're kind of slightly set apart from the other organizations that we would normally be very similar to in the movement, so Commonwealth and others, because of this data capability, and hopefully we'll be able to provide useful kind of actionable analysis to the movement at a low cost or free in the near future. So that'd be really exciting. And the other one is our more kind of traditional position as having a pretty good reputation for producing quite rigorous research, generally linked to quite real world policy recommendations. So whether that's polls or reports, as I said before, we normally get into the mainstream media with it, and we're kind of perceived as being somewhat non-partisan as well. Kind of we do appear in the Times now and then, so that's kind of to our benefit in a way that we can push forward either relatively now mainstream ideas like working time reduction, or slightly fringe ones around carbon taxation or micro work or universal basic income, or other things like that. It's a way in which we can influence public opinion, public awareness, and hopefully policy too.
Okay. I'll go. Gemma's connection may be a little bit dodgy. How do I see our role? I think it's kind of, well, there's kind of like teaching how to use existing technologies that exist in a more effective manner. That's like one kind of thing, like building those technologies. That's another like aspect of it. And then finally, I think like thinking through patterns of organizing that are radical and that are effective, and are egalitarian, but suit our kind of contemporary moment. And yeah, those are the kind of like the three that I think our kind of role is. Gemma, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, sure. It's freezing a lot for me, so I might just drop out. I'm tethering on my phone. Yeah, we always kind of talk about our role as more of an augmenter of capacity and also like a connector. So yeah, the main metaphors, like, yeah, trying to be this kind of connective tissue between lots of different organizations and trying to be, yeah, like using the affordances of digital technology, using our own skill sets in that, and multiplying the work that people are doing already, rather than trying to be, something kind of, making people fit into technology, the way of working, all that kind of thing. So yeah, just like catalyzing the work that people are doing already.
I think that's specifically that focus with like people are doing work all the time, and it's probably like a lot of shared mistakes if everybody tries to also like, oh, we are doing the right thing, everybody's not doing it. Like, no, it's really this consciousness, and this like not just consciousness, but okay, the strategic direction, someone as a group, as a move, as like a campaign, as initiative, organization, whatever you are, as okay, what's our position in this overall ecology of the left? And last episode we had Rodrigo Nunes as a guest, so it's just like the perfect, it's like a nice red thread that ties here through. It's a nice way to end.
We actually read that book. We actually looked at that book during our Common Knowledge retreat last October. So yeah, it's a book that it's quite funny as well, because like the overall organizing metaphor of that book of the ecology was something that like we spoke of in the very like first meeting of like what eventually became Common Knowledge in 2018. So yeah, it's a really good book.
It is. I had the honor, like on another podcast, to interview him and ask some more detailed questions. So it's like, for me personally, it's one of the best books in the last few years I have read politically. Yeah, I think that I didn't see any questions from the audience, sadly, but I want to thank you very, very much for having been here, answering all my. I love the section where we just went into the free flowing. You talk to each other, like that was really, really, really cool. And yeah, also to everybody in the audience who's interested in what we talked about, don't be shy to reach out either to me, to anyone from the panel. I think you almost all have Twitters or like via email or whatever. People will find ways. It should be easy enough. Yes, thank you a lot. And also thanks for your work. It gives me and other people hope, I think, and events like this, this is the good stuff. Thank you.
Thanks
very much.
Thanks.
And I think we can conclude the live stream then. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
You all.